Hey everyone, welcome to the second part of our lecture on music and capitalism. This time we're looking more at the current practices in advertising and kind of how neoliberal capitalism is influencing the music arena and music business. First, I thought I should explain maybe the differences of neoliberal capitalism versus normal capitalism, or capitalisms that kind of have come before it. And this is a little bit murky just because neoliberalism, or the term neoliberal, has been used by different people during different times for different meanings. But basically, for our understanding of it is that neoliberal capitalism is a whole way of thinking and being. It's a cultural system that shapes beliefs, influences your choice, and generalizes the economic form throughout society. And what I mean by that is making every aspect of any interaction a sort of exchange of value. So you can think about this in a variety of different areas, not just cultural production, but in economics, in cultural production, even just in our daily social lives. So this is kind of the newer form of capitalism that we're dealing with today, and has some other traits as well. This, again, neoliberalism really kind of has been around for a while, but really took off in terms of in the kind of early 80s, especially with Reagan and Thatcher, and the kind of deregulation of the economy and of industry, etc. And it's been going on since then. Neoliberalism is really, as I mentioned, the whole way of thinking and being. It's an ideology. It's a mode of governance as well, and it's a set of policies. So it's a way of being. It's how governments operate in many cases. The U.S. is an example. Britain is another example. There are many other examples throughout the world, and it certainly governs a lot of our policies in terms of how we think about the role of government in regulation and the role of just regulation generally. It's also, neoliberalism is also kind of a hyper emphasis on the individual, on free markets, on deregulation, privatization, and really kind of the withdrawal of responsibilities for taking care of people, like welfare type things that were formerly responsibility of the state. So you see this all over the place. Bill Clinton has famously kind of gutted the welfare state during his times and got people off welfare, or welfare to work, that kind of thing. These are kind of all these are examples of neoliberal type thinking. Privatizing, power companies, or in many cases, in many parts of the world, privatizing water supplies is another example. And again, free markets and this emphasis on individual freedom is another kind of hallmark of neoliberalism. And really what it comes down to in the end, especially for our purposes, is that neoliberal capitalism, it works faster, it's more pervasive, and it's more corrosive than previous versions of capitalism. That said, just like the other capitalism we talked about in the previous lecture, nothing is complete, nothing is total. So there are examples of people not operating in a neoliberal capitalist system, examples that go against it. So like I mentioned in the last lecture, it's not a total system, and it's not completely enveloping of all our interactions. There are exceptions to the rule. Some examples we've talked about already, a few of them, of neoliberal capitalism and ideology is this idea of free trade, trade without any kind of tariffs or restrictions. And I put free in quotes on your screen just because there's always some kind of caveat, even though people, especially neoliberal proponents, will kind of advocate for free trade, but sometimes there are caveats to this as well. We can see a kind of a backlash against free trade actually really recently here in this country, with Donald Trump imposing tariffs on many different countries and attempting to kind of put America first. So that's kind of one of the backlashes, and we'll talk about that. The move towards kind of a nationalist response to neoliberal capitalism in a second. But another example of neoliberal capitalism is how the individual responsibility for everything, and how individual freedom is paramount. There's this push in neoliberal capitalist ideology towards market-based solutions. Let the market sort it out. If you make things profitable, or make things worth people's time, make that value worth people's time, then a market solution will always work in the neoliberal ideology. Another thing you see is that the achievements of the wealthy are thought to be a result of merit, of hard work, of an intelligence. And of course, we all know we all come from something, and our circumstances of where we come from always influence uh, how we succeed in life. At least I would hope you would understand that that is really the case. But there, in kind of neoliberal ideology, there's a very much an emphasis on the intelligence and hard work and merit of kind of the wealthy elite, and the reason why they're wealthy is because of their merits. While as in other ideologies, people recognize the effects of class, the effects of kind of legacy, of history, of race, and of all these other things on the success of certain people over others. And lastly, there's this trope of freedom that is kind of paraded out in neoliberal ideology to advance neoliberal ideological goals. And we'll talk about that in a second here. This trope of freedom, as Taylor in your chapter described, as kind of a free-floating ideology that really people use and they attach it to whatever they want to. Oftentimes, this freedom is used to attack regulatory practices that are seen as interfering with the elite's attempt to regain their wealth. And so sometimes you'll see, especially recently, you'll see the idea of consumer choice or individual freedom in the backlash towards the Affordable Care Act. So there's been a lot of people who say the Affordable Care Act is infringing on my freedom to choose my doctors and or my healthcare provider, etc. So that's one example of a neoliberal response to regulation. Is the kind of backlash against the Affordable Health Care Act, or even the idea that people should be allowed to own guns in the U.S. because we have the Second Amendment, that impinging on a person's right to own firearms is an example of somebody impinging on a personal freedom. Again, that's another example of this kind of trope of freedom and neoliberal ideology. There's another kind of trope of freedom that works as well in the kind of cultural arena, and this is the lifestyle choices, your self, your sense of self, your sense of identity, or your sexuality. These things are all, now they're kind of celebrated in a sense where people living different lifestyles, people choosing different identities is the norm, really, while as a few years or decades ago it was much less prominent. And I talked about before the idea that wealth is the result of, quote, right choices or hard work and intelligence, and all these things are added up to these are all kind of encompassed in this idea of individual freedom and the kind of choices you make influencing and being a result of your hard work and merit. What does this trope of freedom lead to? Taylor argues that it leads to a sense of incoherence, that the freedom to believe in yourself as the sole author of your individuality leads to this kind of incoherence, and this incoherence results in anxiety, disintegration of truly public spaces, and as a result, there's been, especially you can see recently in politics, this search for or a kind of reliance on nationalist ideology or kind of even fascist strongman type ideologies as a response to the kind of bewildering diversity, these incoherent lifestyles that people are living, different sets of beliefs. We see this very prominently in the U.S. right now, this kind of response to this incoherence brought about by the trope of freedom that is, again, a hallmark of this neoliberal ideology. So what are some of the musical results of neoliberal capitalism? Well, Taylor mentions a few of them. And the first one would be that it's become socially acceptable to use, your earbuds in public. You can remove yourself from public space into your private musical world. Whereas a few years ago, this is a result of this trope of individual freedom, your freedom to be yourself, irrespective of the people around you. And that kind of leads into this idea that you're able to remove yourself from public spaces with earbuds and music. And it's a pretty common sight to see. As another example is that the increased reliance on numbers and kind of focus group testing has reduced the autonomy of composers for songs, and this is especially true of composers in commercial fields like advertising, television, and radio, etc. That, as he mentioned in the article, composers will kind of pour their best work into their music, give it to their agent or the recording company, whoever wants to, or advertising agency, I guess. And these songs are oftentimes rejected because they don't fit these increasingly exacting kind of metrics and or algorithms that have succeeded in the past. And so this kind of reliance on numbers and also building upon what's succeeded in the past without allowing new things to come up is maybe an example of some of the results of neoliberal capitalism. And the third result is the consolidation of music retailers. So there's a lot fewer choices out there. If you want to go buy physical music, you can go out and buy it, as Taylor mentions, in these big box stores. But even the people who are the companies that are supplying those big box stores are also reduced in number. There's a wave of kind of mergers, corporate mergers going on. And so what happens is you have fewer and fewer producers of musical products. And so basically what happens is your choice is limited just by that, and your choice is also limited because these corporate entities are not willing to invest in marginal artists that aren't guaranteed to make them money. Because as we remember, 80% of many of these recording companies' revenue comes from about 20% of their product, meaning that kind of that slice of music superstars, of pop stars, is what's really giving these corporations all the revenue, while as that's going to be 80% of the revenue, while as they're not willing to invest in marginal or like maybe new unproven musics and put them out in Target and Best Buy, etc., because they're worried about losing a lot of money on these things that aren't proven to work. So these are all some examples. There are many other examples of the kind of results of this kind of hyper individualized, hyper or sped up form of capitalism we see nowadays. But these are some of the examples. And I'm going very quickly through all of these things, and I feel bad for you if you're taking notes. So please feel free to pause the video and write down what you think, and then restart the video as well. Taylor talks a lot about branding in his article, and branding, as he mentions, is kind of a result of the increasing commodification. As music becomes more commodified, in the eras past, in kind of capitalist eras past, where musicians and composers had to kind of appeal to this idea of musical genius to promote themselves and their work. Nowadays, in this kind of neoliberal capitalist environment, musicians are having to brand themselves and either make their own brand and promote that, or attach themselves to a brand. And we'll see examples of both of that later in the lecture. And what the deal is what you want to do is you create appeal and emotional connection to your listeners just through your brand. And so there we'll see the effects of branding in a second. But not just musicians and composers branding themselves, corporations attempt to brand themselves through musicians. And that we'll see, again, other examples of this in the lecture. First, before we see some examples, we'll talk about the kind of three functions of branding. And really, if you think about any kind of well-known brands, these will fit, musical or not. The first function would be to help consumers navigate a crowded marketplace. So let's say we go to Target and you're overwhelmed with the amount of choices you get from, for frying pans, but you know that you want to go and buy a Martha Stewart frying pan. That's a great example of branding. Martha Stewart is a great example for a branding of a person, of a lifestyle, of products. And what it does is it helps you navigate all those bewildering choices out there, and you can kind of zone in on what you want. Branding also reassures consumers of quality and the correctness of their choice. So again, let's take our frying pan example of Martha Stewart. Or at least your experience has been with Martha Stewart brands that they're higher quality. At least you would assume so if you are brand loyal. And the third thing would be that brands engage consumers with distinctive imagery and language, associations, and help consumers identify and create emotional bonds with these brands. And this is particularly effective, and really kind of the idea of branding is you have some almost irrational love of the brand. You can see this, I think, probably most outrageously or starkly in the kind of emotional bond people have with Apple products. When I was a kid, I grew up and Apple was not the kind of giant it is today, but certainly nowadays with you have Apple fanboys and whoever, whatever you want to call them, who wait in line for hours to buy the newest iPhone, not because it makes any rational sense, but because they have such an emotional bond with the brand. And so that's an amazing example of the success of emotional bonding and kind of this almost irrational bonding between a product and people. And we have this in music as well. And we'll, again, like I said, we'll discuss some of those examples in a second. So there's the first example I thought it would be just interesting to look at something that seems really out of place. So if you go to music festivals, there's a lot of corporations attempting to brand themselves at music festivals. And I give you this example of State Farm, and like what would an insurance company, a very old insurance company, be doing at these kind of hip young music festivals? And really what they're trying to do is identify themselves, kind of inculcate themselves in the kind of goodness of young people's hearts by showing up these music festivals, setting up these tents, and they give out free sunscreen and a place to kind of hang out of the sun. And even beyond, just their kind of physical helping out of people at music festivals, there's also tie-ins that they've made and musical partnerships that State Farm has made with bands like OK Go and Blink-182. And they work with other companies like SeatGeek and etc. to kind of identify newer bands to help associate their brand with. And I think it's an interesting, and it probably is successful for State Farm as a company to be inserting themselves in a context that seems completely out of place at first glance. Another one I found was, American Express and its kind of quote unstaged live stream concert experience performances, and they've teamed up with really some well-known and some lesser-known artists, but this is kind of a branding. I wouldn't say it's a festival per se, but a branding by a credit card company that kind of boasts this kind of high-quality production and bringing these kind of really flashy performances to with Vivo and YouTube events, and also airing live shows as well. American Express now has a music app, which seems, I mean, what is a credit card company doing with a music app? And it sponsors artists in residence, and it has a platform for promoting women in music and a bunch of other things. And it seems very it seems, again, like this branding thing is really interesting because it's kind of far out. What is a credit card company doing with all these famous artists and kind of fostering new artists? Well, what they're trying to do is, again, associate their brand and create an emotional bond with American Express consumers through music. So you have the music app if you want to listen to American Express music app, or you can know that the songs are being curated there, and if you like it, then you're kind of, again, associating yourself, creating this emotional identification with a brand. So the two questions I would have is, what's the reason for American Express to partner with these musicians? And what's the reason for the musicians? And the answers are pretty, like I've been mentioning, that American Express gets an emotional appeal from it appeals to its consumers emotionally, I guess, through music. Everyone loves Justin Timberlake, right? So how could we not like American Express as well? And what do the musicians get out of this? If you're a well-established musician, you're probably getting quite a bit of money to be associated with American Express. If you're an up-and-coming musician, you get a platform for distributing your work, distributing your products. And so there's branding works in corporate branding, at least works in two ways. It can be beneficial to the musicians to a degree, and it certainly is beneficial to the corporations as long as they are savvy enough to do it correctly. And these are some of the examples of the American Express musicians, brand musicians. You have Taylor Swift, you have Usher, you have the Killers, Kings of Leon, like all these other musicians. So it's a established and as far as I understand, pretty successful branding effort. There are other examples of branding that are successful and maybe not so successful. There's an example of Microsoft branding with the French Electronic Act M83. And M83 really is kind of embracing this 80s kind of, I don't want to say video game, but kind of cyberpunk sound. And they actually collaborated with Microsoft to produce this kind of 8-bit video game that you can play. You can actually play it right now if you like. You can go download the Microsoft game if you have a Microsoft Windows computer or a tablet, etc. And here in this game, it really is the music by M83 is kind of mirrored in the video game, and I'll link the video below if you want to just watch the kind of the YouTube video of the game. But it's basically a car chasing another car through the city, and it's this interactive music video experience rather than just watching a music video. Now they're allowing you to kind of participate in it. And although this is kind of a little bit clunky as far as video games go, really what it's doing is kind of showing off the capabilities of Microsoft products, and showing off how if you play it on like a Microsoft Surface or in the Microsoft Edge browser, you get bonus Easter eggs and things like that. And this is not the first example of the kind of teaming up of video game and musicians and corporations. There's other examples, like by others, by Skrillex and De La Soul, and even the metal band Testament, and these having paired up with kind of companies to make video game music videos, and these are a lot more, maybe more difficult than maybe your traditional music video to create, but they are oftentimes very successful in reaching new markets. And if we recall, the kind of two ways that capitalism works is it conquers new markets or creates new markets to keep selling things. And so this is an example of both kind of creating and conquering a new market. So you can listen to the music now, pause the lecture, listen to the video below, or I'll put a link in there for you if you want to actually download and play the game. It's quite short, actually. The game only lasts as long as the song does, but feel free to have some fun with that. And I couldn't pass up, since we're on the topic of music and video games, there are many other games that are not necessarily branding of music bands, but they certainly offer that opportunity, and some are. But I gave a couple examples of videos you could just watch. They're a little more fun to watch than the Microsoft M83 video. But there's this Archaea video game, which I gave you a link to a video of a guy playing it on a tablet, and it's absolutely insane to watch. There's another virtual reality game called Beat Saber. I've never played it before, but it looks pretty fun. Again, I gave you another example of this. And musicians and bands are certainly tying in with the video game industry to create content and to kind of, again, open up new markets to music, open up new markets to corporations that produce these video games, etc. So those are two examples. If you want to pause and watch those, feel free. So I thought I should include another example of music and corporate branding from around the world, and this is a great example by Coke Studio, which really took off in 2007, first in Brazil, and then 2008 in Pakistan, and then more recently around the Middle East and Africa. The Coke Studio really brings in musicians that are using traditional music and updating it for a modern audience. And what this is doing is they're taking something that has been kind of at least folk music or traditional music and making it extra cool by kind of updating it for younger audiences. And I'll quote from one of the people associated with Coke Studio here to give you a sense of kind of what their goals are. For Coke Studio Pakistan, it says, quote, "By weaving together Eastern values with Western influences, Coke Studio introduces the youth of Pakistan to their cultural fabric in a way that is totally palatable and acceptable to them. They are introduced to languages they've never heard and hear lyrics that stimulate them emotionally and intellectually. Coke Studio has given a strong sense of ownership, inspiration, and pride to Pakistanis. This phenomenal asset is all about bridging barriers by fueling optimism and opening happiness, which is what Coca-Cola stands for. End quote. And what you hear is just again this Coke has now become the um, the way through which Pakistanis can hear traditional music updated for maybe modern tastes. Again, this is also about kind of creating kind of an inclusive and diverse culture and an emotional bond between Coca-Cola and the youth of Pakistan and other countries. This was not just in Pakistan; it became wildly popular in India as well, and they started their own Coke Studio India as well. But really, what you see is this corporate attempt to capture the inclusive spirit by highlighting music, this kind of traditional music that's updated, this modern, that is kind of non-sectarian in a way. It's been going on for quite a long time. If you search on YouTube for Coke Studio, you'll find many seasons examples. This video here that I have on your screen is from season 11, but there's lots of different music out there, really nicely produced music. But what you're seeing is this branding of musicians and corporations working together to create an emotional bond, to introduce Pakistanis to their traditional culture in a new way. So it's a very effective, this type of branding is extraordinarily effective and very popular. So I give you a chance, if you want to pause and watch this video or another Coke Studio video if you want to search for them. There's a great section here, at least from minute 7:30. If you want to start about there, it starts off with a little bit of an electric sitar solo and then gets a little more rocking after that. But again, another great example of the way brands are attempting to create emotional bonds between the consumers and associate a commodity product, which Coca-Cola, with something greater, something more, maybe more transcendent than just Coca-Cola. This is about music, this is about culture, this is about language, this is about introducing a new generation to something great, and Coke is right there with you. There's also a discussion in the chapter you read about how branding and marketing and advertising has reached even in places once thought unbrandable, or at least kind of above the kind of fray of advertising, and that's with Western classical music and advertising. And I gave you two examples here. One of Laura St. John, this kind of iconic photo that she did a long time ago. Normally, works for solo violin are very staid covers. With this, instead, she has her, naked, except for covered up by a violin, really kind of using her female sexuality to sell Bach, which is maybe the first time that's been done. And this is a while back, but you have since then really a lot of different examples of this type of using sexuality, and also branding and advertising what was considered kind of elite and above the fray music. And again, you have that on here on the St. John's Passion. You have this virtually naked woman here praying to somebody. Again, that's kind of this new way of advertising what was formerly above this type of advertising. You have this as well in other types of other musics from around the world, and so a couple of examples I thought of immediately was Anushka Shankar, who is the daughter of Ravi Shankar, the famous sitar player and famously associated with the Beatles in the 1960s. And again, this sort of this type of branding or this type of advertising for a classical music, again, like Western classical music, like the Laura St. John cover, you have Anushka Shankar's Rise, which is kind of a very sensual front cover, and her apparently, as far as we can tell, naked with a sitar on the back cover. And I just wanted to contrast that with your typical Indian classical music covers that I gave her an example of her father, fully dressed, although it's got some cool lighting on the right-hand side with Ravi Shankar, it's very much more staid and more traditionally classical music advertising, while as there's been this push to kind of make everything sexy, and that goes for Western classical music and other traditional and classical musics around the world. Also in your chapter, Tim Taylor talks about advertising and taste, and how taste, that kind of, or musical taste, it was once really associated, and as we discussed in the last lecture, very associated with social class, how that's been changed, and really how advertising is increasingly driving musical taste and really taste in everything. So what was once considered kind of the purview of the elite classes, kind of elite knowledge, like knowledge about Shakespeare or Beethoven, or kind of this high art type stuff, is no longer really what's valued in the kind of elite, higher, upper echelons of social class culture. Coolness and knowledge of what's hip, that's even more important, and that's what you have. You have a change in the kind of traditional arc or traditional graphs, as I showed you last lecture about the musical taste as associated with social class. That's been changed, as Taylor argues, by advertising in this kind of new neoliberal capitalist era. And I've certainly seen that, examples of this in my own life. I know my wife's grandparents, who are very well, very very intelligent and well educated. They were doctors, and you go into their house and their big bookshelf, and it was covered with books with Shakespeare and books about history and encyclopedias and all these kind of traditional examples of elite knowledge, and they were certainly part of the elite social classes. They were pretty wealthy, and but as time went on, those Shakespeare books were taken off the shelf less and less, especially by my wife's grandmother, who was really a very hip, cool lady, and she was 90 years old. She was wearing leather pants and always very aware of the latest trends and the latest things that are cool, the latest fashions, and everyone thought she was awesome, cool grandma. And so again, you have this. I have a very personal example of how elite knowledge was no longer valued as much as it was, well as understanding the trends, understanding the coolness, and what's hip is certainly now at least on par with what was formerly the kind of coveted knowledge of or coveted taste of the elite. And really, you have this shift in ideology is present in how we describe people. Taylor gives an example of how certain people have been described as, like poor people have been described as in the past as intemperate or whatever. And now, if you describe people who are poor because they're not intelligent, they're idiots who haven't done the right thing with their time. And I could think about that stereotypically if we think about America and we think about the hip fashion centers on the coasts, in New York and Los Angeles, and kind of coastal hipness, and the kind of center of the country being this kind of unhip, slow, slightly less intelligent. And I'm not saying these are things I think, but these are kind of stereotypes we have about our country. The flyover states always seem to be catching up with the latest fashions. They're always a little behind, and that's not because it takes long for somebody to ship a pair of boots from Los Angeles to Iowa or wherever, but that fashion sense is related to knowledge and also intelligence. So again, these are all examples. Again, those previous things I just said were stereotypes, not something I'm advocating, but these are all examples of how neoliberal capitalism is as an ideology not only works in economic terms, but also in ideological terms, and how it influences our ideas about things, our choices, our perceptions, and understanding or our perceptions of how things work. And as Taylor mentions in the article, he talks about Bourdieu and a few other theorists and how they've talked about the loss of autonomy in cultural production and consumption, that this loss of autonomy is a direct consequence of neoliberal capitalist ideology, and that advertising really helps promulgate this ideology of economics over all things, right? And so these are the kind of, again, these two all-encompassing things about neoliberal capitalism and the kind of pervasiveness and the speed at which it works in our society, and how advertising really has pushed that the notion of economic ideology over all things in the country. So This all sounds quite depressing, right? If we talked about the last lecture about, we mentioned a little bit about Adorno and the culture industries, and this lecture about neoliberal capitalism and its kind of corrosive and pervasiveness in our society, what's to be done? And I took a few examples from later on in Tim Taylor's book, but there are many other examples I would like to hear your thoughts on. What is to be done in the face of this kind of overwhelming homogenization and loss of choice, and this anxiety and push towards squeezing the worker, this in our case the musicians and composers, squeezing them for all the last little things they can get, and the kind of hyper individualization and incoherence that maybe this neoliberal ideology leads to. What's to be done? And so a few examples that Tim Taylor mentions later on in his book are that how certain musicians have thrived in very small niche markets. So they have restricted their production of commodities. So he gives one example of a band who likes to put out their songs on cassette tape. And this kind of restricted production keeps everything small, keeps their fan base very tightly knit, because it's not as easily, the music is not as easily disseminated, and it's also just a more kind of a personal way of dealing with things. It's not a corporate way of attempting to make money. He mentions how these bands also oftentimes are not operating on economic terms, right? They're not charging money to record things and then charging you for the cassette tapes, but they're oftentimes giving things away for free. And I think maybe that's one example of how we can combat this neoliberal capitalist ideology, is keep the idea of gifts and free things kind of at least partly in our minds when operating as musicians. The way these bands, again, that Taylor mentions, they don't chase technology. They're not looking for the newest, latest, greatest way of disseminating their music. They put it on cassette tape. Why? Because it's easy for them to do. It's something that everyone can access for very cheap. That one of the band members mentions how it's a great deal if they sell a cassette for $5 and you get 25 songs on the cassette. It's a great deal for the consumer, but it's also allowing them to kind of opt out of the chase of the newest and greatest technological way of giving your music out. And mostly it is this kind of ethos of remaining independent or remaining indie. You don't want to, quote, quote, sell out to corporations. You have to kind of opt for a smaller fan base, maybe opt for a smaller paycheck. And that's maybe some ways that Taylor hinted at, or these musicians have hinted out, ways of escaping the kind of monolithic culture industry. I would like to see if you have put up a question on the discussion board about your thoughts about how capitalism and neoliberal capitalism has influenced the music industry. And like I mentioned before, you guys are a great source of knowledge because you're students at a university that's focused on the recording arts and music business, etc. And so I would love to hear your thoughts about maybe some examples of the neoliberal ideology creeping into your life or your work, your examples. And also I'd like to hear your thoughts on how you combat it, whether or not it's necessary to combat this this ideology and system of mode of being, really, and what you can do to combat it. So I'll put that up on the discussion board. I want to thank you all very much for your comments so far. I will get to grading your concert ethnography papers very soon. And thanks very much for watching the lecture. I wish you all a very happy Thanksgiving. Thanks. Bye.